Thanks, Rory. That was comedy gold. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Claire, and I've got something very exciting to share with you. I work for the government. That's right. Unlike the other nerdy academics that you're hearing from today, I'm a cool public servant. Shout out to all the public servants in the room. The slide you can see is actually a bit of a decoy. I'm not going to be talking about the current trajectory of public service jobs. I am going to tell you about what I do for government though, which is to look after our native plants and animals, particularly the threatened species that might need an extra helping hand. Maybe you'll be lucky enough to hear some cool stories of the chubby-cheeked, broad-toothed rat who's threatened. Or Victoria's state emblem, the helmeted honeyeater. Who's also threatened. Or maybe even the poison rice flower, which sounds mildly threatening, but is actually also threatened. So my job involves taking a regular species and looking at all the data and information that we've got. And if it meets certain criteria and thresholds, then I change it from being a regular species to a threatened species. Now, I don't mean putting a species through a sausage machine literally. That'd be really counterproductive. Now, the criteria are quite particular. So it's lucky that I'm a detail-oriented person. I actually competed in the Australian Jigsaw Puzzle Championships recently, so you're looking for any proof. And in case you're wondering, to qualify, you have to fill in a form and show up. It's very strict. Now, it's a sad fact that our threatened list keeps on growing, but at least by keeping an eye on these species, we can look after them and stop them from suffering the same fate as the dodo. Or dial-up. But gee, what a bargain. Adding a threatened species to the list is complex, and there are lots of checks and balances. Once they're on the list, it means that we look after them, and we can't just build a highway through their habitat. So I spend my day going from checkpoint to checkpoint through the criteria, making sure that everything's in order. It's a little bit like orienteering, where you go from checkpoint to checkpoint. Did I mention I was a national champion in that sport too? You know the one, you get the map and the compass, and you've got to navigate your way between the orange and white flags in the bush. Maybe you did it on school camp. Probably thought it was pretty cool, huh? Maybe you even found a threatened species along the way. But how do we actually work out whether a species qualifies as threatened? Let's look at what's involved in adding something to the threatened species list and how it's an important part of protecting Victoria's environment. Now, I'm fairly new to this team, so I thought maybe the best thing we could do would be to work through an assessment together, and that way we can all learn at the same time. I was working in climate change before. There's something about getting home at the end of the day, utterly depressed about the state of the world, that I just can't get enough of. But it's okay, I've got some pretty cool hobbies to cheer me up. So, I am a lapsed botanist. So I thought maybe we could walk through a plant species together. But then, maybe some of you think that plants aren't really that cool. Okay, so an animal then. think I've come up with something really cool, a little bit unusual, something that will appeal to everyone. Australian orienteers, are we thriving? Or are we on the way to extinction? Like Maiden's bush pea? Or the eastern hair wallaby? Oh. Or Pokemon Go, which has had a huge population crash since 2020. So let's see whether Australian orienteers are a threatened species or not. We'll use the standardised criteria and thresholds that were developed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN. And then at the end, we'll come up with a rating. Critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, or least concern, not threatened. So, the first step is to gather the data. For a threatened species, you might think that looks something like this, or maybe like this. Unfortunately for me, usually looks a lot more like this. And sometimes there's heaps of data. Sometimes there's not very much at all. Sometimes it's conflicting. It's like when you're looking under the couch for the last pieces of the puzzle, and all you come up with is a fur ball and pieces from a different puzzle that you don't even remember starting. Once we've got all our fur balls and puzzle pieces, we start by pulling together some introductory information. Things like taxonomy and the scientific name. Habitat, which is varied. Ecology and reproduction. And when I was a kid, they used to sell bumper stickers for orienteers cars. They said things like, orienteering, the family sport. Orienteering, cunning running. And orienteers, do it in the bush. So we've answered our question. Now we're ready to start. We've got 3 criteria to navigate our way through to find out whether Australian orienteers are a threatened species. So criterion 1 looks at population decline. The thinking here is that if the population of a species has declined in the past or is likely to in the future, then we might be worried about it going extinct. Now the trick here is that it's based on a 3-generation timeframe. So for humans, generations are roughly 20 to 30 years apart. Now I've been trawling the internet trying to find orienteering club membership statistics from 60 years ago. And long story short, I couldn't find any. So criterion 1, it's kind of not really sure. But that's actually a great example because it's fairly common to not have enough information from monitoring through time to make a good assessment for criterion 1. On to criterion 2 then. Now this one involves a map. So the orienteer in the room is getting pretty excited. Criterion 2 looks at geographic range. And if you're wondering, there's chocolate. Now the theory here is that if all Australian orienteers occur in a small area, then a single disaster or disease could wipe us all out in one go. Or at least send us into some kind of 28 days later situation, which prospects aren't great either. Now with animals and plants, sometimes we move them around the landscape to spread some of this risk, like we did for the eastern bristlebird when its habitat was threatened by bushfires. But we're talking about humans in this example, and kidnapping is not an endorsed conservation strategy. However, if we look at this map of orienteering clubs across Australia and the area that they cover, it's about 8 million kilometres square. And luckily, that puts us well over all the relevant thresholds. So we're safe this time. Which takes us to criterion 3, small or declining population. Now, we said earlier that we don't have statistics for membership going back 3 generations in time. But we do have some pretty good stats for current membership. So in 2022, there were 3,850 members of orienteering clubs in Australia. And that actually meets the first threshold for vulnerable. But there's a second condition that we have to meet. So we need to have a declining population. And back in 2009, there were over 9,000 orientees in Australia. Now, we're less than 4,000. That means we've lost about 400 people per year. That's about the same number of people as get killed by hippos. I think we should mount a search party. Or stop orienteering at Werribee Zoo. The big question is that population likely to decline another 10% over the next 3 generations? Honestly, probably yes. Which means that Australian orienteers are a threatened species at increased risk of extinction. We're vulnerable. But at least the good news is now that we know that orienteers are threatened, we can put some actions in place to protect our precious orienteers. So I'll be taking donations after the show. Now I've left out about 98% of the detail because I'm sure you've all got places to be later. But hopefully you've learned something here this afternoon about how we assess threatened species, or how cool public servants are, or maybe you've just been inspired to do your bit and join an orienteering club. Thank you.